Did you know that a unit of black soldiers, composed of men from the African American community of Harlem, became one of the most respected and feared units of World War I? They faced more challenges than any other unit, not only against enemies on the front lines but also against discrimination and racism from their own country. Now discover the incredible story of the Harlem Hellfighters, a unit that, despite being rejected by society and the United States itself, proved their courage and secured eternity in the pages of military and cultural history. At the beginning of the 20th century in a segregated America, the dream of many young black men was to be seen and respected as full citizens, but the reality was relentless. Opportunities for African Americans were scarce, and discrimination was the norm. Despite this, the men of Harlem, an iconic neighborhood in New York, were determined to fight for justice and honor, not only for themselves but also to prove that they were as heroic as any white soldier. By the time the United States entered World War I in 1917, a large number of black men enlisted in the armed forces with the hope of serving and demonstrating their worth. And this is how the 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, was formed. But what no one knew was that this unit, which would become legendary, would have to face not only the horrors of the battlefield but also immense hostility within the U.S. Army itself, which viewed them as second-class citizens. Racism within the military ranks was a constant obstacle, and the Hellfighters, like their fellow soldiers, were treated as inferiors, despite being trained for war with the same intensity and commitment as the white soldiers. And it was this difference, this relentless discrimination, that forged an unbreakable spirit in the Hellfighters. The arrival in France, the beginning of the legend. When the Harlem Hellfighters finally arrived in France, the French had been at war for more than 3 years, and the scene was terrifying. The blood spilled in the trenches, the roar of explosions, the constant struggle for survival, everything was much darker and more cruel than anyone could imagine. But even in the face of immense difficulties, the Hellfighters were ready to prove that they were not just soldiers, but warriors with a mission. The regiment was integrated into the French army, largely because the United States refused to trust black units in such intense battles. But this decision turned out to be a stroke of luck for the French, who quickly realized they were dealing with an unparalleled unit. The skill, courage, and fierce determination of the Hellfighters quickly stood out on the battlefield. In a way that was not common for American units, the Hellfighters faced heavy combat heroically, often being sent to the most dangerous front lines, facing the enemy with an unexpected strength, and surprising even the French officers, who initially viewed them as inferior soldiers. Challenge, resilience, and heroism. As time passed, it became clear that the Harlem Hellfighters were not just good soldiers, they were indomitable heroes. They participated in some of the toughest battles of the conflict, such as the Battle of Chateau-Thierry, where they fought for days without rest, relentlessly facing the enemy. Every advance was marked by blood, sweat, and courage, but the resilience of the Hellfighters had no limits. While other regiments withdrew, they advanced, not allowing fear or fatigue to bring them down. They were called the Devils of Harlem by the German soldiers, an expression of respect and terror. The name, which initially sounded like a joke, soon turned into a true legend of courage and strength. The French themselves, impressed by the bravery of the Hellfighters, began to treat them with an honor never before seen for American troops, recognizing them as the bravest regiment of the war. James Reese Europe's band, the Sound of Freedom. In addition to their heroism in battle, there was another factor that made the Harlem Hellfighters stand out: music. James Reese Europe, leader of the regiment's band, was responsible for bringing the soul of jazz to the battlefield. His band played for the soldiers, not only to lift their spirits but also to bring hope back to those on the brink of exhaustion. With their infectious melodies and engaging rhythms, the music became a vital force for the Hellfighters, becoming a symbol of cultural resistance. The band played for the French troops and also for the civilians on the front lines, creating an atmosphere of unity and strength, something that the sound of war could never destroy. When the regiment went to France, jazz was still a relatively new art form, but when the Hellfighters returned, the world already knew jazz as one of the greatest cultural legacies of the United States, and much of this was thanks to James Reese Europe's band and the extraordinary work of the Harlem soldiers. And what happened when the Hellfighters returned to the United States? They returned to a country that did not recognize them as heroes but instead treated them with the same racism they had faced before the war. Despite their bravery and the culture they had helped popularize, many soldiers faced hostility when they landed back on American soil. Institutionalized racism continued to prevail, and many soldiers were met with indifference by a society that refused to recognize their courage. Still, the Harlem Hellfighters maintained their dignity and continued to fight, but now in a different way. They were no longer just on a physical battlefield, they were fighting for a place in historical recognition, for a society that would finally see them as equals. Slowly, their story began to be told in books, documentaries, and even films. But for many years, the Harlem Hellfighters were an untold legend. They were heroes without proper recognition, warriors who fought in a hostile world, defying expectations and showing along the way that the true spirit of a soldier is not determined by the color of his skin, but by the strength of his heart. The return to the promised land, the fight for recognition. When the Harlem Hellfighters returned to the United States, their hopes of being received as heroes were quickly crushed by the harsh reality of institutionalized racism. Although they had earned the highest honors on French soil and had been praised for their bravery and courage, when they stepped onto American soil, the reception was cold, indifferent, and in many cases hostile. In the United States, racism was a daily reality, and for many of the soldiers of the 369th Infantry Regiment, the war against racial discrimination seemed harder than the battles they faced in the trenches. Even with victory in hand, the victories in the battle for racial equality seemed far away. They were forced to return to a country where, despite their victories, they were seen as second-class citizens. The treatment they received was a painful reminder that the color of their skin still determined the value that society would assign them. The segregated regime was still strong, and the lack of recognition and appreciation for African Americans in society was constant. When the Hellfighters arrived at the New York port, there was little public celebration, a modest, almost disdainful reception. There were no grand parades or warm cheers. Instead, they were received as if their courage and the lives they lost were not worthy of celebration. And so, many returned to their homes silently without official recognition, but with the fighting spirit still intact. Even so, this feeling of disregard did not weaken the memory of the regiment. The courage of the Hellfighters in battle, and the tradition of resistance they represented, did not die with the initial forgetfulness. On the contrary, they became symbols of strength and resilience for an entire generation of African Americans. Jazz, the immortal cultural legacy. Although the treatment of the Harlem Hellfighters was shameful, their cultural legacy flourished in other areas, especially music. James Reese Europe, leader of the regiment's band, was one of the key figures who helped immortalize jazz as a revolutionary genre. Europe brought the cultural roots of Harlem jazz to France, and through his band, many musicians of the time saw jazz as an expression of resistance and freedom. After the war, Reese Europe's music spread across the world, and he became one of the greatest names in African American music. His work helped popularize jazz not only among black people but also among whites and Europeans, and the genre became one of the greatest cultural legacies of the United States. However, Europe was tragically murdered in 1919 while still at the height of his career, but his influence endures to this day. Despite his efforts not being widely recognized at the time, jazz, now considered one of the greatest contributions to American culture, owes much to the Harlem Hellfighters and their impact on music and black culture in the country. The late recognition, the Hellfighters in history. It was only decades after the war, at the end of the 20th century, that the true value of the Harlem Hellfighters began to be recognized by American society. During the civil rights movement in the 1960s, the story of the Harlem Soldiers was reclaimed as a symbol of the struggle for justice and racial equality. The late recognition, though significant, did not erase the injustice they suffered during their lives. The name of the Harlem Hellfighters was finally recorded in the annals of history as one of the greatest examples of courage, determination, and resilience. Monuments were erected, and several books and films began to tell their story, including a growing re-evaluation of their role in the war and in American culture. They became icons for the civil rights generation and for all those willing to fight against oppression. In 2001, more than 80 years after the war, the U.S. Congress finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the unit, a recognition that, though late, represented a historic justice for these soldiers. The legacy of the Harlem Hellfighters today. The story of the Harlem Hellfighters is not limited to the war, jazz, or medals of honor. Their true legacy lies in their struggle against adversity, their resilience in the face of injustice, and the example they continue to provide for future generations. They were pioneers in the fight for equality and freedom, not only on the battlefield but also in a society deeply rooted in racist and segregated practices. They not only helped win an international war but also helped open the doors for future generations of African Americans, showing that heroes can come from anywhere regardless of skin color. The fight that never ended, the legacy of the Hellfighters. Today, the Harlem Hellfighters continue to be a symbol of courage and perseverance, remembered by those who understand that the true value of a person is not in their appearance but in their ability to fight against injustices and achieve victories in an unforgiving world. The story of these heroes is a testament to resistance, not only against an external enemy but against the internal forces of hatred and oppression that, throughout history, tried to silence those who dared to challenge the norms. The legend of the Harlem Hellfighters will always be remembered, not only as a war story but as an example of what it means to be truly invincible. The fight that never ended, the legacy of the Hellfighters. While many of the Hellfighters returned home, trying to reintegrate into everyday life, society ignored them. The newspapers did not celebrate their deeds, and the story they had written in the trenches was being buried by forgetfulness. Racism did not dissipate with the signing of the armistice. On the contrary, it was a constant that stubbornly haunted American society, where black people were systematically treated as second-class citizens, and discrimination remained strong, even in military circles. However, the resistance of these men did not die in silence. They became heroes not only for their bravery but for their tireless fight against a system that sought to erase them. They fought not only in distant battlefields but also in the daily struggle for the dignity and respect that every human being deserves. The battle for racial equality, which was still an ongoing struggle in the 1920s, became the real war for many of the veterans. After the war, some of the Harlem Hellfighters faced challenges even more difficult than the combat. Men like Henry Johnson, who during the war did the impossible by taking down several German soldiers with his bare hands when he was alone and severely wounded, had difficulty gaining recognition for his actions. He received a French medal and was celebrated as a hero in France, but in the United States he had to wait decades before his courage was finally officially recognized. Henry Johnson, for example, was a monumental figure, a true legend of the war. He not only saved the lives of his fellow soldiers during an ambush but also fiercely resisted an attempt at capture that cost him several severe wounds. His bravery in the Battle of Belleau Wood is one of the most epic and heroic stories of World War I. But at home, the ignorance and indifference faced by black veterans didn't stop. There were no parades or recognitions for black men, and this caused many to become disillusioned with how the homeland treated those who had fought and sacrificed for it. The late discovery, cultural resistance. While the Harlem Hellfighters were not treated as heroes in their own country, the growing cultural world quickly recognized the profound influence they had left. Jazz, as mentioned earlier, blossomed as one of Harlem's greatest cultural contributions, especially with the work of James Reese Europe, who helped popularize jazz in the big cities and beyond, even to the European continent. The music of the regiment, not only in battlefields but also in outings and during rest moments, represented a reflection of the Hellfighters' unbreakable spirit. Jazz became a symbol of liberation, a form of expression of black identity, and a silent protest against oppression. The vibrant sound and dynamic rhythm coming from the regiment's bands not only helped keep the soldiers in high spirits but also contributed to the transformation of popular music worldwide. The final recognition, late tributes and appreciation. Decades passed and eventually the resistance of the Harlem Hellfighters did not go unnoticed. During the second half of the 20th century, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, the contributions of men like Henry Johnson, James Reese Europe, and the other members of the regiment began to be more recognized. The story began to be retold, and the movement for racial justice was finally embraced by the rest of American society. In 1996, a grand ceremony was held to honor the heroes of Harlem. The Congressional Gold Medal was awarded to them in a public ceremony, more than 70 years after World War I. This recognition finally brought some relief to the men who had fought so much for a country that initially treated them with disdain. This symbolic act of justice was a partial reparation for what these men had suffered. However, the true victory of these heroes was not simply the medal or the late recognition. They had achieved something more. Their legacy survived racism, war, and the silence imposed by history. The Harlem Hellfighters became a fundamental part of American history, not only for their battlefield exploits but for the cultural and social impact they left. Their fight for dignity, courage in the face of adversity, and unwavering resistance to racism were examples to be followed by generations of African Americans who came afterward. The power of collective struggle, the living legacy. The legacy of the Harlem Hellfighters is not just a story of brave individuals. It is also a collective story of resistance, of an entire community coming together to fight against the injustices that permeated society. Over the years, their story has inspired countless people who were fighting in other battlegrounds, for civil rights, racial equality, and a fairer society. From Harlem to the world, the message of the Hellfighters resonated in every note of jazz, in every civil rights movement, and in the daily struggles against racism. They showed that even in the face of adversity and prejudice, the strength of a united community can change history. Their deeds were the fuel for the racial justice movement, a seed that sprouted during the war, flourished in culture, and eventually solidified in the fight for human rights. Today, the Harlem Hellfighters are remembered not only as soldiers but as pioneers in the fight for a more equal world. Their courage in the face of oppression continues to inspire those who, like them, refuse to be silenced by history. The late recognition, though important, does not erase the injustice they faced throughout their lives. They were not just war heroes, they were heroes of freedom, resistance, and equality. And their story will continue to be told for generations, reminding us that true victory is not just found on the battlefields but in the ongoing fight for dignity, respect, and justice.